What to make of this, I thought, lying in my madhouse bed, later on that long night. A vivid dream is the easiest explanation, a kind of tying up of the whole thing, now that I'm officially on the mend. But I sniffed the sleeves of my bathrobe and got a whiff of cloves. Or did I imagine that, too? Like my little game with Rose, did I imagine her giving the failed artist Chaz's address when I asked her in the barn? I felt so bad about frightening her in the hall at Krebs's house, but only in a vague and distant way, like it had happened long ago to someone else. It was sweet not to have any of it matter under these wonderful drugs. I slept then, deep and dreamless, and in the morning when I passed my door on the way to the toilet, I happened to look out the little window, and who should I see but Krebs? He was in deep consultation with Dr. Schick and another man, one whose face I knew well, because I'd drawn a portrait of it in Madrid. Dr. Schick seemed to be explaining something to him, and he was nodding. Well then, as Krebs suggested, he must be some kind of mental health guy, although he still had the face of a gangster. About an hour later, after breakfast, Dr. Schick came in, and I had a long session with him. I gave him the life story, and how I felt about painting, and especially about the paintings I was doing, the slick nudes, I meant, and why I should imagine myself an impoverished, though principled hack, rather than a wealthy and fashionable painter. He had a lot of good things to say about the fragility of the mind, and how it sometimes cracked under the strain of contrary urges and desires. Not at all unusual, he said, even among highly successful people. I told him about the Salvinorin, and he wiggled his eyebrows and said, "Well, no wonder." I asked him what was in that implant that they removed, and he said they didn't know. It was empty. What could it have been, I asked. I would have to guess there, he said, for of course I have no medical records here for you. But people have had good success with such devices for dispensing antipsychotics. You know, many of these suffering from forms of schizophrenia refuse to take their medications, and this is one way to fix that. I agreed that this was a possible explanation, and we chatted some more about controlling my symptoms. He gave me a prescription for more calming drugs, and also for Haldol, which he thought I'd do well on. Almost an ideal Haldol patient, he said. I must have been, because a few days later I was discharged. I sat out on a bench in the sun outside the hospital. I was trying to recall painting those Wilmot nudes I'd seen, and the events that went with that life. And you know, it started to come back to me, my shows, mingling with the rich and famous, doing the paintings, and bit by bit I assembled memories of that life. It's amazing what the mind can do. After a while, a Mercedes pulled up on the drive with Franco at the wheel, and I got in, and he drove me back to the Krebs establishment. I did wonder why Lottie hadn't come to see me at the hospital, but I found that she'd left to bring Milo to his Swiss clinic, taking Rose with her. That was fine by me. It's embarrassing to be crazy, especially the kind of crazy I was, where you've forgotten the life you lived with another person. Were we really still married in this life? I hadn't asked. A few days passed. Not a bad existence, I had to admit. Responsibilities were few. One never wanted for company. And I had the run of the place except for Krebs's office. Time just flowed on by. I didn't pick up a brush or a pencil after returning from the nut house, but I knew I eventually would, maybe as an outsider artist, like those brilliant schizophrenics who cover acres of paper with their obsessions. Or maybe I will cleave more closely to the mainstream and turn my craziness into real money, like Van Gogh and Cornell and Munch, or go back to the pricey nudes. I detected a certain tension in the house. It was because the auction of the Venus had been scheduled in New York. D-Day was, I believe, just 3 days away, and the worlds of art and high finance, is there a difference, were churning like baskets of eels. I saw a copy of Der Spiegel lying around with the painting spread over the cover, with the blurb stating that the painting would go on the block with a reserve price of $110 million. I didn't get a chance to read the article. They restricted my access to media. Doctor's orders. Later that day, Kellerman handed me a cell phone, and it was Lottie from Geneva. She said the special rich people clinic has poked Milo and examined his insides and declared that, yeah, they can make him good as new for about $1 million, more or less. A few new organs required, but it turns out that for these we don't have to go on no stinking list either. They're ready more or less when we are. Milo does look a little less peaky, she says. Maybe it's the hope. To her great credit, Lottie asked about the source of the putative organs, and the man didn't quite get why she was asking. She said she didn't want them to, come from people especially murdered to provide them, and the guy was shocked she would have thought such a thing, this being Switzerland, and very correct. No, they have deals with people in high-risk professions, money up front, and we get your good parts when the parachute doesn't open. And also they'll pay for the education of a cohort of kids, and should they drown some summer, the families let them take a cut, so to speak. Very rational and actuarial, something like dairy farming, ever a Swiss specialty. Whether it's legal in the strict sense, she didn't ask. I had a discussion with Krebs about the money end of this plan. It seemed that $1 million was at that moment sitting in a Swiss account for me, in payment of all the paintings he'd sold from my vast output, which he'd been representing for years. Sorry you don't recall that, Wilmot. Sorry you recall something that didn't happen. And sorry you don't recall something that did. But hey, you're crazy. I took this in calmly, or the Haldol did. The fact is I can't help liking him, and I think he genuinely likes me. That evening I wandered into the room Rose had occupied, wondering when I'd get to see the kids again, if ever, and I saw, taped to the wall, one of her shredder strip paste-ups. It was of 2 fat piggies in a green field. Clearly she'd found a supply of pink. Well, you know I really have a good eye for color, and a very good memory for color, if not much else, and something about the strips of pink paper she was using to construct the pigs made a connection in my head. Many of her strips had on them small sections of an intense rose madder. I poked around the room, looking for the source, and after a while I found it, stuck in the back of a bureau drawer, a clear plastic bag full of shredder waste, mainly pink. I took it back to my room and dumped the strips onto the floor. I was lucky that it was a strip shredder and not the confetti kind, because you can do a pretty good job of reconstruction on that kind of strip. After the Iranian students took over the Tehran embassy back in '79, they had teams of women reconstruct a lot of CIA secrets from the shredder waste, and I sat there all night and did the same thing, using a glue stick. It wasn't perfect when I got through, but you could see what it was. When I was done, I sat through the dawn and the early morning thinking about what had been done to me, and also about why I wasn't angrier. I wasn't really angry at all, just sad. Relieved? A little, but mainly sad. How could she have? But I knew the answer to that. There was a little stone terrace on the east side of the house, with a table and an umbrella set up on it, and there Krebs liked to take his breakfast alone, read 6 newspapers, and I suppose plot his next crimes. No one is supposed to interrupt him there, but I figured this was a special occasion. I walked out into the early sunlight and held my paste-up in front of his face. He looked at it for a moment, sighed, and said, "That Liesl, honestly, she's been told 100 times to attend to the burn bags before she does anything else." He gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Wilmot. Tell me, what do you think you have there?" "I have there a Photoshop printout of an unfinished fake painting I last saw in a loft I was supposedly living in on Greenwich Street in New York. I was so rattled that I didn't look at it closely enough, or I would have seen it was a huge inkjet image printed onto canvas, then artfully gone over with a brush, and then glazed. I assume the images in that phony gallery were made in the same way."